September 1940. In the United States, the vibe is grim. Open a newspaper, and the story feels basically decided. London is burning, Britain is wobbling, and a German invasion looks like it could happen any day. In Washington, planners stare at maps and quietly work through the unthinkable, what the world looks like if Britain goes under. And inside the American embassy in London, one man is sending message after message back home. Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy. His reports don't sound hopeful, they sound final. To him, British democracy isn't just struggling, it's on the verge of going out. From across the Atlantic, plenty of Americans agree, because look at the scoreboard in 1940, France collapsed fast. The Low Countries got crushed. Norway and Denmark were gone. Germany's army looked like a machine that didn't stall, didn't miss, didn't slow down. And now that machine was pointed straight at a small island with nowhere to retreat. So the American conclusion seems logical. Britain is alone. And Britain is finished. Before we go on, if you like WWI stories that cut through the myths and show how decisions were really made, tap subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Here's the key thing though. A country can look defeated long before it's actually beaten. And in 1940, the U.S. was watching Britain through smoke, headlines, and assumptions. Americans saw rubble and exhaustion. They saw a shrinking empire clinging to pride. What they didn't see, at least not clearly yet, was the quiet change happening underneath the damage. Not a collapse, a hardening, a nation figuring out how to survive. Because even before the worst bombing hit London, many American observers had already written Britain's obituary. Go back to June 1940, Dunkirk. The British Army escaped from France, but it left behind a mountain of heavy gear, tanks, artillery, trucks, supplies, abandoned in the rush to get men off the beaches. From a military point of view, that loss was brutal. American military attachés and analysts looked at those facts and came to a cold conclusion. Britain didn't have the kind of army you need to stop an invasion. Inside U.S. government circles, assessments floating around were blunt. Not emotional, not hateful, just math. Britain can't win. Britain might not even last through the summer. The question is not if Germany will cross the channel, but when. And Kennedy's cables fit perfectly into that mindset. He had influence in Washington, and his tone reinforced the worst fears. He met reporters, talked to officials, and sent updates that painted a picture of a country cracking under pressure, low morale, weak defenses, leadership he believed was dreaming instead of facing reality. Back in the U.S., this fed a bigger argument that was already boiling. Why send weapons to a country that's about to fall? To a neutral America, shipping planes and guns to Britain could feel like tossing supplies into the ocean. Isolationist voices got louder. Let Europe fight it out. Why get dragged into something already decided? Even regular people felt it. Newsreels showed burning streets. Radio reports carried sirens and explosions. Photographs captured families standing in wreckage with that blank, stunned look people get when their world is shattered. So in American living rooms, the story became simple. Britain is brave, sure, but doomed. What this story missed was the difference between losing battles and losing the will to continue. Britain had lost equipment, it had lost allies, it had lost ground, but it hadn't quit. And that part doesn't always travel well across an ocean. In American minds, Britain was a fading power, built for an older kind of war. Many assumed it couldn't adjust to Germany's modern speed and air power. Germany had numbers. Germany had momentum. Germany had a record of quick wins. So when the air fighting started over southern England in the summer of 1940, a lot of Americans expected it to end like everything else. Fast. The Battle of Britain begins in earnest, July into August into September. German raids come in heavy waves, bombers escorted by fighters, pushing toward airfields, radar sites, and aircraft factories. German leaders were confident they could smash the Royal Air Force and clear the way for invasion. From far away, American analysts saw no reason to doubt that confidence. The math looked one-sided. Germany had more combat experience from Poland and France, more aircraft, more pilots who'd been winning. But then something happened that did not fit the American script. The RAF didn't fold. Not only did it keep flying, it kept showing up day after day, meeting formations that should have overwhelmed it. British pilots took off from damaged airfields. Squadrons flew with exhausted men and patched up aircraft. Losses were real and painful, but German losses weren't small either, and they weren't the kind Germany expected. For anyone watching from a distance, it was confusing. Because Britain was supposed to be running out of planes, of trained pilots, of functioning bases, yet every day, British fighters rose into the air again. So what was keeping the RAF alive? A lot of it was invisible unless you were inside the system. Radar stations, hit repeatedly, still kept giving warning. Not perfect, but enough. The British had a way to see raids forming and moving. That early notice mattered because it bought time. Time to scramble fighters, time to position squadrons, time to avoid wasting aircraft in the wrong place. And then there was how Fighter Command was organized under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't romantic. It was structured and coordinated, designed to stretch limited forces and throw them into the right fight at the right moment. From the outside, it didn't look like a dramatic last stand. It looked like a machine refusing to stop. Even more surprising, British aircraft production wasn't dying the way many assumed. Factories were dispersed, work shifted, hours stretched, and more workers, especially women, moved into industrial roles as the country mobilized harder and harder. British output didn't solve everything, but it kept replacing losses in a way that German planners and outside observers underestimated. By early September, Germany was paying a higher price than it expected. Bomber crews were taking punishment, fighters were being lost, and the big prize, total air superiority, was still not in Germany's hands. That meant something huge. If Germany couldn't control the skies, an invasion across the Channel becomes a nightmare. And yet, the smoke over London was getting thicker because Germany was about to make a choice, one that would shock civilians, fuel America's darkest headlines, and test whether Britain's willpower was real or just talk. The next phase wasn't aimed at airfields anymore. It was aimed at the people. September 7th, 1940, German bombers shift their focus. Instead of hitting airfields and radar stations, the Luftwaffe turns toward London itself. That night, hundreds of aircraft unload high explosives and incendiaries across the city. Docks erupt in fire. Warehouses burn. Whole blocks disappear under collapsing brick and flame. The glow is so bright it can be seen miles away. And it doesn't stop. Night after night, the bombs keep falling. 57 nights in a row at first. Then the attacks spread outward. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Bristol, Glasgow. No major city feels safe. Factories are hit. Homes vanish. Thousands are killed. Tens of thousands are suddenly homeless, carrying what they can through streets that no longer look familiar. From the American point of view, this looks like confirmation of everything they feared. Correspondents in London send back reports that sound apocalyptic. Radio broadcasts carry the wail of sirens and the dull thump of explosions. Edward R. Murrow speaks calmly from rooftops and darkened streets, describing a city under punishment unlike anything modern civilians had endured. To American ears, it sounds like a breaking point. Ambassador Kennedy walks through bombed neighborhoods and returns to the embassy shaken. His cables to Washington grow even more convinced. Britain, he says, cannot take this. Not for long. The people are stretched thin. The government is barely holding things together. One more push, one more wave of bombing, and collapse will follow. But Kennedy, like many Americans, was watching the surface and missing what lay underneath. Yes, London was burning. Yes, the losses were real, but something else was happening that didn't fit the script of a nation about to give up. When the siren sounded at night, millions of people didn't run screaming into the streets. They went underground. London's tube stations became shelters, platforms filled with families laying out blankets. Children slept on concrete floors. Elderly neighbors huddled together. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't heroic. But it worked. People survived the night. And in the morning, they came back up. They looked at the damage. They cleared rubble. And then, this is the part Americans struggle to understand, they went to work. Factories that were hit didn't stay down for long. Machinery was moved. Production lines shifted into basements, tunnels, and smaller workshops scattered across the countryside. If one site was destroyed, workers relocated. If equipment was damaged, it was repaired or replaced. The British economy wasn't running smoothly. It was grinding forward. American analysts had assumed bombing would paralyze production. Instead, it forced adaptation. Britain didn't get more efficient in the modern sense. It got tougher, less wasted motion, fewer luxuries, more focus. What shocked German planners and confused American observers was the lack of mass panic. The Blitz was supposed to break civilian morale. Terror bombing was meant to trigger riots, strikes, and demands for peace. That theory had worked elsewhere. Germany expected it to work again. It didn't. There were no mass uprisings, no calls for surrender filling the streets, no sudden collapse of order. Instead, British cities absorbed the punishment with a kind of stubborn routine. Fire watchers climbed rooftops. Rescue teams organized themselves. Neighbors helped neighbors. Families who lost homes were taken in by others. None of it made dramatic headlines, but it kept society functioning. From the outside, it almost looked unreal. Captured German airmen later admitted their confusion. They had been told British resistance was crumbling. Instead, they found a population that kept showing up at factories, at shipyards, at airfields, no matter how much damage was done the night before. To Americans, this reaction was hard to process. The United States had never experienced sustained aerial bombardment. There was no cultural reference point for what Britain was living through. From an American perspective, the British response looked almost irrational. Why endure this? Why not negotiate? Why not accept terms while there was still something left to save? What Americans missed was the calculation happening inside Britain itself. For the British, surrender didn't mean peace. It meant occupation. And occupation meant the end of everything they recognized, their government, their freedoms, their way of life. Faced with that choice, enduring the bombing became the only option that made sense. So they endured. By late 1940, American assumptions started running into a problem they couldn't ignore. Time. Britain was supposed to collapse in September, then October, then November, but the calendar kept moving, and Britain was still there. Bombs were still falling. Cities were still burning. Losses were still mounting. But the state hadn't broken. The economy hadn't seized up. The government hadn't fallen. And something else was happening beyond the cities, something Americans barely noticed at first. Britain was quietly retooling itself for total war. Before the conflict, British industry had been solid, but not overwhelming. It relied heavily on imports and global trade. When France fell and the Atlantic turned deadly, many Americans assumed Britain's industrial output would shrink with its access to resources. Instead, the opposite happened. Civilian production was cut to the bone. Car factories stopped making cars and started building tanks. Textile mills switched to uniforms and parachutes. Anything that didn't directly serve the war effort was sidelined. Rationing tightened. Consumer goods disappeared. To Americans, photographs of long queues and empty shelves looked like desperation. Inside Britain, it was discipline. Every resource was measured. Every calorie counted. Steel, fuel, labor, all allocated with ruthless efficiency. Britain wasn't starving. It was prioritizing. Aircraft production told the clearest story. Before the war, output had been modest. By 1940, it surged. By 1941, it surged again. Factories ran day and night. New workers, many of them women, filled assembly lines. Planes lost in combat were replaced faster than Germany expected. Tank production followed the same pattern. The designs weren't perfect. German armor often had advantages in firepower and protection, but British tanks kept coming. Losses were replaced. New units formed. American military attachés watching these numbers began to feel uneasy. The math wasn't working out the way it was supposed to. Britain had a smaller population. Its cities were under constant attack. Its trade routes were threatened. And yet its war output kept climbing. Some American officials quietly wondered if the British were exaggerating, padding statistics to keep U.S. support alive. They weren't. If anything, British reports understated the scale of mobilization. The island that was expected to crack under pressure had compressed itself into something denser, harder to break, harder to intimidate. What Ambassador Kennedy never fully grasped was this: Britain wasn't fighting the war it had planned. It was fighting the war it was forced into, and in that struggle it discovered reserves of endurance that neither Germany nor the United States had expected. By early 1941, the American picture of Britain was starting to change, not because of victory, but because collapse never came. And that raised a dangerous question for everyone who had written Britain off. What if this country wasn't finished at all? What if it was only getting started? Spring 1941. The shift in American thinking doesn't come from a single battle or speech. It comes from something far less dramatic. Britain is still standing. Month after month passes. The bombing continues. Losses pile up. And yet the country doesn't fold. In Washington, the language inside reports quietly changes. Britain is no longer described as on the verge of defeat. New words appear instead: holding, enduring, resilient. They aren't words of victory, but they are no longer words of doom. The biggest crack in the old American narrative comes when Joseph Kennedy leaves London. His pessimism had shaped early U.S. perceptions more than almost anyone else. When his replacement, John Winant, arrives, he brings fewer assumptions and a different lens. What he reports back surprises people. British morale isn't shattered, industry isn't collapsing, the public isn't demanding peace. If anything, Winant describes a population that's angrier and more determined than before. The suffering is real, but so is the resolve. By this point, the Royal Air Force isn't just surviving, it's expanding. Training programs that were rushed and improvised in 1940 are now more efficient. Pilots are being produced faster, aircraft output keeps climbing. By mid-1941, Britain is building more planes per month than Germany. On the ground, the British Army looks nothing like it did after Dunkirk. New divisions form. Equipment, much of it British-made, replaces what was lost in France. Training grows tougher. Doctrine evolves. American military observers watching British exercises note something unexpected: confidence. These aren't broken troops. They're veterans in the making. At sea, the Royal Navy still dominates the surface, even as German U-boats tear into Atlantic convoys. Losses are heavy. The Battle of the Atlantic is brutal, but Britain's merchant fleet keeps sailing, supported by aggressive shipbuilding and escort tactics. Rationing tightens. Luxuries vanish. But Britain doesn't starve. Every ship that reaches port matters. Every delivery is a small victory Germany can't fully stop. By the time Germany launches its invasion of the Soviet Union in summer 1941, American perceptions of Britain have changed for good. Britain is no longer viewed as a dying empire clinging to pride. It's seen as a country that absorbed the worst Germany could deliver and stayed in the fight. Then comes December 1941. Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, the United States isn't watching the war anymore. It's in it. And almost immediately, American forces begin working alongside the British in ways that force a brutal reassessment of earlier assumptions. U.S. officers arriving in Britain expect to find a nation barely holding together. Instead, they find something else entirely. A military that's been under fire for years. A system hardened by experience. A country that has already paid for its lessons in blood. American pilots training with the RAF discover British air combat doctrine forged during the Battle of Britain is sophisticated and unforgiving. Night bombing tactics, air defense coordination, convoy protection, British methods are years ahead of what many Americans expected. U.S. bomber crews preparing for daylight raids study British losses and start to understand what they're walking into. On land, American divisions training alongside British units notice the same thing. British soldiers move with cohesion and confidence. They understand logistics. They understand terrain. They understand what works and what gets people killed. These are not the men of Dunkirk. These are survivors. At sea, cooperation becomes essential. American destroyers join British convoys. Shipyards in the U.S. build vessels based on British experience. Intelligence is shared. Losses are shared. And slowly, American commanders realize the truth. Britain didn't carry the war alone because it wanted to. It did it because it had to. And necessity forged something formidable. By mid-1942, as American forces prepare for major operations in North Africa, the partnership looks different. The U.S. brings massive industrial power and manpower. Britain brings experience, hard-earned and expensive. Neither could win alone. Together, they form an alliance Germany never truly prepared for. The Americans who wrote Britain off in 1940 fade from relevance. New officers and officials see the country clearly, not as it was imagined, but as it actually is: scarred, exhausted, still dangerous. Looking back, the American misjudgment of Britain reveals more than a failure of intelligence. It shows how assumptions shape perception. The U.S. looked at Britain and saw an old empire nearing its end. What it missed was the part that mattered. Britain didn't fight like an empire. It didn't rely on grand offensives or early victories. It endured. It adapted. It survived one more day, then another, until survival itself became resistance. The Battle of Britain wasn't won because Britain was stronger than Germany. It was won because Britain refused to accept that strength alone decided outcomes. Joseph Kennedy's cables weren't malicious. They were logical. They were based on reasonable assumptions about what nations and populations could endure. They were wrong because they measured the wrong things. Kennedy saw destruction and predicted collapse. He should have looked at reconstruction and seen determination. The Blitz didn't break Britain. It revealed Britain. Stripped of comfort, stripped of certainty, left with no option except resistance, the British chose to keep going. In doing so, they preserved the one thing Germany couldn't destroy, the possibility of victory. By the time the United States entered the war, Britain had already won its most important battle. Not against Germany, against despair. If this story changed how you look at 1940, hit the like button. It helps more people find the real history, not just the headlines. The bombs fell, cities burned, thousands died, but Britain stood. And in standing, it kept the war alive long enough for the balance to change. The Americans learned the lesson slowly, 1 month at a time. Britain wasn't finished in 1940. It was just beginning. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one everyone underestimates, and sometimes the most powerful ally is the one you thought was already defeated.